Well, it's late, or rather, very early. I've got a bit of a headache, can't sleep. So I've had something on my mind for a while for a number of reasons, both related to things in my own life and things going on in the lives of people around me. More than one, I should add. Um, and this is something that society has really gotten wrong: sexuality in the modern era. And understand that the breakdown of the family unit is the breakdown of society. Um, According to the Annie Casey Foundation, uh, 2/3 of black children are born into single parent households. Generally, that means they're going to be raised by their mother or grandmother, and dad's not in the picture. What this means for young men is they grow up angry, they grow up without a role model. And so, what you have is really a a failed culture. Because of that, you have a minority, blacks in the United States, and they are disproportionately involved in violent crimes. That's just a fact. And why is that? It comes down to the breakdown of the family unit. Many people will try to sell other explanations for that, um, but that is the reality of it. It comes down to the breakdown of the family unit. The family unit is important. In nature, we see that animals teach their young how to hunt, uh, and and you know and things like that, how to survive. And the family serves a similar purpose for human beings. We need children need to be instilled with a worldview. Um, they are a vacuum of knowledge, a vacuum of perspective, and if a parent just takes their hands off and says, "Well, I want them to figure it all out for themselves," um, chances are that child will not, because the world is a corrupt and broken place, determined to corrupt and break children and exploit them. And so, with a dearth of good nurture, kids grow up broken, and thus they pass that on. It becomes a cycle, a broken cycle. The Annie Casey Foundation points out that children raised in single parent homes are more likely themselves to father children out of wedlock or to become pregnant outside of marriage, and then to be single parents themselves or to be fathers who abandon their children. And so, sexuality, human sexual relations, and the family unit, these things are critically important. So what we're seeing with blacks in the United States have the most drastic rate. Like I said, 2 out of every 3 black children are raised in single parent homes. That is a staggering figure. Um, uh, I worked with a young black woman one time, and she said something that has always stuck in my mind. Now, this is her experience, uh, and the experience of the people she knew and grew up with and what have you. Um, and there are certainly exceptions to this, but she said there's no such thing as a black father, and that is a pretty staggering statement coming from a young black woman, a little bit younger than me, that I knew. And but what's happening in the black community, that breakdown of their culture, um, that moral decay, ultimately, they're on the leading edge of it, but other demographics are catching up. Um, and I think the order was, blacks have the largest number of children growing up in single parent homes. Then you have Latinos, then whites, and then Asians. And interestingly enough, there's a correlation there with what is generally perceived to be success in life and society, success and financial success, and being a benefit to society, being a productive member of the community, and so forth. But it all comes down to that family unit. You know, remember that in Genesis, when God created everything, before society as a whole came along, the family unit preceded it. The family unit came first. It was Adam and Eve before they had any children, before there were other families. You know, once you have a multiplicity of families, then I guess you could argue that you have a society at that point. But the family, Adam and Eve's family, preceded society. It is the bedrock, it is the core foundation of society, and that's why it's called the nuclear family. And in the Bible, it is meant to be one man and one woman for life. And there's a reason for that. And we see this in Genesis 1 and 2, the creation. Let me just say, Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And yes, God does identify as the masculine, and there's a reason for this. I'm not going to take the time to look it up just now, but there is a hierarchy of of spiritual authority. So the head of the woman is the man. The head of the man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. Don't be confused here. This is not saying that Christ was not God, but Christ took upon himself the form of a man and became a servant during his advent here on earth, during his earthly life and ministry. And so he actually said himself, I always do the things that please my Father. So Christ was, during his earthly life, under authority and fulfilled the law perfectly, the laws of God. But Jesus Christ, was also God in the flesh. But there is that distinction there because Christ humbled himself and put himself under God's authority. But the head, or the spiritual authority over the woman, is the man, and the head or authority over the man is Christ. And this is mirrored in the marriage, which in the scriptures is one man, one woman for life. That's how God intended it to be. And now understand, one man and one woman. Now the Bible says that there'll be one flesh. And I believe that's in Genesis 2. Let me just see here if we can find it. Yeah, Genesis 2:24, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So in God's eyes, once that marriage process is complete, there is a knitting, and they become one organism together. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment, and what that should look like in the marriage. But for now, marriage, one man, one woman, for life. There's that cleaving, and the Bible says what God has joined. Let me look this up. It might be what God hath joined. I think it is, actually. Here we go. Wherefore they are no more twain, they're not two anymore when they become married, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. That marriage is intended. Now, the world has a facsimile of marriage, but it lacks the, there's civil unions and things like that. that lack the spiritual perspective. They're missing some of the picture. Uh, it is a spiritual union, and it's a covenant before God and ultimately with God to be faithful to that other person for life. And so, really, in a marriage, while I do say that it is one man, one woman for life, there are actually three in the marriage: man, wife. Actually, we'll put God, man, and wife. And this functions as essentially a triangle. Think of God at the apex, and then man and wife as the two other points of the triangle below. And ideally, what should be happening is the man and the wife, if they are both let's see if we can illustrate this here. Here's our triangle, very rudimentary. The man and God should have a relationship, and this does need to pre-exist the marriage. And so that's something that I'm coming into. I'm being challenged in my own life in regards to this, because I do want a wife. I don't want to be alone forever. And I've become kind of complacent and content, like I haven't been developing this relationship like I should, admittedly. And that's a problem. But the man should be pursuing God. They should be building this relationship and growing closer together. Man should be getting closer to God. And then the wife should also have that relationship as well with the Creator. And so in this marriage, the three, if man and wife are both getting closer to God, then they are also, by extension, getting closer to each other here. Now, if one of them is pulling in a different direction, so for example, the man is a Christian and he's pursuing that relationship with God, but the wife is a heathen and she is pursuing the world and in rebellion against God and traveling off in this distance, in this direction, that pulls the man and the wife in different directions. There's going to be a distance there. There's going to be tension and contention in the marriage. So this works when it's all in balance, when the man has a proper relationship with his wife. He is a servant leader. He should be sacrificing for her. He should be a leader. Got to spend time with your wife. Got to do things that please your wife. Got to learn about your wife. Study her. Learn how to serve her better. There's a book out there about the different love languages. There are numerous different ones, and you got to learn how to speak your partner's love language. There's touch and sexual love. There's words of love and encouragement. There's giving gifts. There's acts of service and so forth. I haven't read the book. I've heard about it here and there from various people. You just got to figure out what resonates with your partner best, and then do those things to build that relationship, spending time together and so forth. That part of the relationship needs to be there. But before God created Eve, it was Adam and God, and they communed. They had a friendship. God taught Adam, and that was the case before Eve ever came on the scene. That's the starting point, that relationship between man and God. And then man finds a good, godly wife. Now, in the case of Adam and Eve, God actually custom made Adam his wife. He didn't have to choose, he didn't have to wonder if he was getting the right one. He absolutely did. But as I said, all these reciprocal relationships all have to be balanced in order for that marriage to be strong. Otherwise, there's going to be tension there, and there are outside forces looking to disrupt and destroy every nuclear marriage, every family. ultimately every life and human soul. And so any weakness or cracks in that will be attacked and under erosion, spiritual erosion. One man, one woman for life. Now the Bible does point out that Moses issued writs of divorcement to the children of Israel because they were hard-hearted, but that was never God's intention. Unfortunately, divorce is something extremely common these days just because people are hard-hearted and broken, and the world's a broken place, and people marry for the wrong reasons, and they divorce for the wrong reasons. And it is a sad state of affairs. And then there's a ton of people who just don't bother to get married in the first place, which is not good either. And we'll maybe talk about some of that stuff in just a little bit here. But let's talk about this one flesh relationship here. They shall be one flesh. I had a Christian pastor kind of lay this stuff out and break it down in a Christian perspective. Really interesting, really informative. So understand, where does the one flesh part of this relationship come from? Well, it's from the sexual part of the marriage. So he put it this way: sex is the glue that holds a godly marriage together. If you want to be closer to your spouse, if you want to have a strong marriage, you should be having regular sex. And the Bible actually lays this out very clearly. See, there's this there's these sort of wrong views about what Christians think about sex. Let's get this down here. So here's some misconceptions. Sex for procreation only. Missionary position only. No pleasure, especially for the woman. And I'm just going to put this sex as a bargaining chip. Let's talk about these. So firstly, the idea that sex is for procreation only is illogical and dumb. You can just look at nature and infer that the human sexual relationship is much different than what we see in nature. In nature, animals have their breeding seasons, and they're generally just not going around having sex outside of those times. In nature, with animals, and understand animals are distinct from people. People are not animals. People did not evolve from animals. The Bible's very clear about that. Animals, though, have sex. Now, they do derive pleasure for it, and in our broken world, there are aberrant behaviors that do pop up in nature. Absolutely. That being said, though, generally speaking, sex in nature is for purposes of procreation. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any animal that, we could talk around that in several different ways. I guess there are some animals whose life cycle is so short that you could argue that they do have sexual intercourse year-round, but that's just because, their life cycle might be a matter of days or what have you. So in order for that population to continue, yes, they need to be constantly, whenever they can, at certain points in their development cycle, doing that to carry on the species. But there's no mating seasons for humans. Now there is, the woman's cycle and everything, but year-round, a woman can conceive and have children. So there's it's just different. It's very different from what we see with the natural cycles in the animal kingdom. And the Bible is very clear that sex is for pleasure. The book Song of Solomon is all about physical sexual pleasure between a man, a husband, and a wife. Um, I've only read that book of the Bible once, and maybe I should take another look at it one of these days. There is some very interesting things in there, but you know, God made sex pleasurable. In the right context, it's completely okay to enjoy it, and actually, in the scriptures, um, husbands and wives are commanded to enjoy it. It should be something that satisfies them and brings comfort and delight. And let's see. The Bible actually says that husbands and wives should be having regular sex. Yeah, here we go. 1 Corinthians 7:5. Let's talk about this a little bit. Yeah, now regular sex, that's going to look different from marriage to marriage. Let me read this. We'll just go ahead and start at verse 1. 1 Corinthians 7:1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment, for I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. Okay, and actually I'll read the next one too. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. God's words, not Paul's. Let not the wife depart from her husband. And then we can talk about this. Divorce is not a good thing. And if a divorce happens and then the two parties remarry, in God's eyes on a spiritual level, that counts as infidelity or adultery. And the Bible's pretty clear about that. And that's a hard thing in the modern era to teach, because so few people will want to receive that, but that's what the Bible lays out. But let's talk about this a little bit, because we're talking about sex in the Christian marriage. Sex is the glue that holds the Christian marriage together. To my knowledge, the Bible only has this one reason for a couple to not have regular sex. And I do mean a married couple. The Bible is clear that sex outside of marriage is the sin of fornication, and it did carry with it a capital punishment back in the under the Old Testament law, back when the Jewish people were under theocracy, ruled by God. Now there was some, well, let's put it this way. There were some different lines and boundaries drawn there than we would in the modern era. For example, you would have a young person, a young man and a young woman betrothed to each other, it seems like. And so there were some allowances in place if those two as a couple, because they were intended to marry each other, it was something that their families, would have decided ahead of time. An arranged marriage, basically. And if they were unable to restrain themselves and, had intercourse before the appropriate time, then I believe they would just go ahead and marry them early, so to speak. And since they were betrothed or intended for each other anyways, it wasn't as serious a thing as, for example, two people committing adultery or having sex outside of marriage. And there's a whole host of things that we could talk about related to that. We're more focused on the marriage right now, and so I don't necessarily want to go off on those rabbit trails. Um, but here we see that God actually considers it defrauding your spouse if you're not having regular sex with each other. Now, notice something here. The text doesn't say what regular sex, what that's going to look like. Is that, once a week, once a day, twice a day? It's just going to be a balancing point that the couple needs to work out. But it is a priority thing that they should be making time to do, because that is the one flesh bond. If you're not tuning yourself to your spouse through this mystical union, and there is a mystical spiritual component to it, then there's going to be distance in that relationship. And the one reason that the Bible gives for putting that on pause is that with mutual consent, the husband and wife decide to give themselves to prayer and fasting. And I'm pretty sure that most couples aren't going to agree to do that. And so this is why I put sex as a bargaining chip. You see this so often in relationships, where one partner or the other is holding out on the other one to punish them or to get something out of them, extort them, basically. That is not the biblical view of sex at all. Here we see the wife doesn't have power over her own body, the husband does. And the husband does not have power over his own body, but the wife does. Now, of course, we could infer that there should be some allowances for medical conditions and, health issues and things like that may arise, or life circumstances and what have you. But the principle is here. The regular sexual intercourse should be part of a godly Christian marriage. And the Bible also says that the marriage bed is pure and undefiled in all. Let's look that up real quick if I can find it. Here we go. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So a whore is a prostitute, a monger is someone who buys or sells. So there's a whole category of that could, well, let's just lay some out. So prostitutes would fall under this category. This would be people that sell their bodies. Pimps, those who prostitute out other people. Those would be whoremongers. People who pay for sex, arguably those who pay for pornography. And then just those who are extremely promiscuous and who are treating other people as if they're objects, as if they're commodities. So that's all of those things could be encapsulated with whoremongers. It's the idea of treating a person as property in some way. And adulterers God will judge. But marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. So there is this stereotype or misconception out there that Christian sex should be in the missionary position only. I'm not going to say much about this, except that the boundaries of that sexual relationship, what the couple is comfortable with, what they experiment with, what they do or don't do, that is for them to work out within the boundaries of marriage. The Bible says all of it's okay and permissible. The bed is undefiled in all. Now, other biblical principles do apply, I believe. No one in the marriage relationship should be the couple should not be engaging in activities that are dangerous or unhealthy or destructive of the body. And the couple should not be engaging in anything that leaves one of the partners feeling dominated used, cheapened, humiliated, shamed, that would not be appropriate either. So those principles, I think, would apply. And a Christian commentator that I heard the other day said also things like role play. Uh, Got to be careful with that because purity is something that the Christians should strive for. So role playing an inappropriate or illicit sexual situation, that's not purity. That's not pure. That's not something that Christians should be involved with, I don't think. But a husband and wife have to set their own boundaries. And then no pleasure, especially for women. There were different groups that you have to realize something that the Christian faith here in the United States was heavily influenced by certain religious groups, and some of them were very, uh, well, were just plain out wrong on some of their views. There were women in some of the original colonies who taught things like that women should not ever have sexual pleasure, and they did teach things that like sex was for procreation only within a Christian community, and these were false views being taught by false teachers. But these views became influential, were part of certain sects and groups, and we have the term puritanical. The Bible. Now, some people are going to disagree with me. The Bible does not forbid the drinking of alcohol, for example. And I can prove that scripturally. Not going to focus on that now. But because there are certain historical sects in the United States that forbade the drinking and creation of alcohol, that kind of trickled down to a lot of denominations today and is widely taught. Same thing about some of these other misconceptions: sex for procreation only, and that women should not have pleasure in sex. These things can be traced back to some of those sects, and those sects were wrong about other things too. Some of them did not permit musical instruments or music in worship, and the Bible is very clear that musical instruments and music in worship is important. And likewise, some of those sects forbade dancing. And this is kind of a tricky one in the modern era. I don't really know of any Bible-believing, Bible-teaching churches that have a favorable view of dancing. I've never encountered one. But the Bible is clear that there is an appropriate form of dancing, even as a form of worship. But what that looks like, it is incredibly hard to say because, obviously dancing in the modern era involves alcohol, provocative dress, highly sexualized, and erotic. But, Israel, historically, and the Hebrews, they were a culture that danced. We see that all throughout the Bible. I just mentioned those things to point out that, the different Christian denominations today, they might get certain things correct. They might be correct on their, red line core spiritual issues, but I'm not really aware of any that has a package deal that I think is truly scriptural, and completely correctly tuned on every issue. And a lot of these issues are preconceptions that are rooted in the teachings of old historic sects that were influential in the past. And this is why the Bereans were commended. They searched the scriptures, they knew these things for themselves. And they were willing to even question the apostles in the interest of making sure that things were being done in a scriptural fashion. Okay, so I think we've talked about some surprising things about Christian sex. Should be regular, and the husband and wife define what exactly it's going to look like. It might be a little kinky, and that's about all I'm going to say on that. But as I mentioned, other principles do apply. No one should be degraded, and nothing unsafe that damages the body should be going on there, because the body is God's temple. Now, Paul, you have to understand, he mentions this in passing, and I'll talk about it too. He's saying, I personally wish, basically, that all men were even as I myself. He was celibate. He had something that I've heard Christian teachers call the gift of celibacy. But every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner, speaking specifically of being able to abstain from marriage and sexuality altogether, and another after that, and there's other gifts as well, he's saying. So it's good for the unmarried and for widows to stay unmarried and celibate. But if they cannot contain, or in other words, their physical passions are getting out of control, and to the point where it's a constant temptation, then they should marry. It's better to marry than to burn with that temptation, to burn with lust. And then for the married, stay married. He says, I command, but it's not really me. It's actually the Lord commanding this. Let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled. And I'm not going to necessarily, all right, let's just keep reading, I guess, and see where things settle out. Or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So, divorcement in Hebrew culture was a little bit one-sided, to where the husbands were able to put away their wives for, the Bible alludes to this at certain times and places anyway. They were able to divorce for really any pretext whatsoever. And so the husband here is described as putting away his wife, because he would be the one initiating the divorcement. A wife's not really, it's a very patriarchal society back then. The wife is not really going to be speaking against her husband and initiating that. And the wife is described as departing from her husband, so she might abandon him if he's abusive or whatever, but that would not technically be divorcement. It would just be a separation. She's fleeing for some reason. Now, not going to touch on this in great detail, but I think there are contexts where it's where it is justifiable for the wife to depart, but they should be for serious things, like her life, her children's lives, their well-being is under threat. And then the Bible talks a little bit more about marriages where one spouse is a believer and the other isn't. In those cases, it is better for them to stay together, Paul says, because you don't know if the Christian is going to be able to influence the other for the better, and eventually if they will become a Christian as well from the good testimony of their spouse. Very possible. It says here, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Okay. So lots of interesting things there. Definitely worthy of some study if you have further questions on that. Excuse me. And let's just say that God's ways of doing things, they're logical, they're reasonable, they make sense. Why does the nuclear family, one man and one woman, work? Why has it historically worked so well? Well, you have a man and you have a woman. The sexes are binary. I hate to break it to you. And so having a man and a woman in that relationship, men and women, their natures are different. They complement each other and round each other out. As God said when he created Eve for Adam, it is not good for man to be alone. Let us create a helper meet for him, I believe is what the scriptures said about that. And what is a helper? A helper who is meet, Meet, I believe. Let me just find this if I can. Yeah, here we go. Genesis 2:18, the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him." So the wife is to be a helper, and meet just means suitable or fitting. She's someone who complements the husband. And I will speak to that a little bit because there are some people that feel like a traditional marriage is oppressive in some way to the woman. That's not the case at all. And I would point out that there have been many. How do I put this exactly? There's probably going to be some generalities and some patterns that emerge just because of the differences in men's nature and in women's nature. But understand that not all men are these, he-men, hunter, warrior types, and not all women are these shy, demure, quiet housewife types. And their interests can be wildly different as well. I think each marriage is going to be innately unique. And in the modern era, unfortunately, just because of the economic realities of things, uh, the husband may not be the sole breadwinner, and the wife may not be a stay at home mom. They might both have to work, or the husband might have to work full time, the wife might have to work part time. The wife might have gone to college and be doing a job, nursing or something, for example, where she makes more money than the husband. That's not a shameful thing. That's just, the reality of how things play out sometimes. And likewise, understand that she is to be a helpmeet or a suitable helper for her husband. She might actually be helping him in his occupation, not necessarily just around the house. An example of this is some of the scientists of the past, the Curies, I believe, um, come to mind, where actually I think Madame Curie was more famous and well known and more accomplished than her husband, even though they were, working in the same field. They were suitable partners for each other. And so that, women can absolutely have professional careers and things like that. It's really up to, like I said, each marriage is going to look a little bit different. There are certainly some biblical principles about appropriateness of, well, let's put it this way: there are some roles there. The Bible is pretty clear. We've talked about this: the hierarchy of spiritual authority. The man is to be the leader in the marriage, the spiritual leader. Because understand, you still do have two human beings, even though they're one flesh in the eyes of God. And they ideally, hopefully, if they have the same worldview and common goals, and they are a good fit for each other, they should agree most of the time. But they will come to points where they disagree about things, about a decision, for example, and someone has to be the tiebreaker, and that's the man. He has the spiritual headship, the spiritual authority in the marriage. Now, he is not to dominate and trample his wife. A wise husband should listen to his wife's counsel, and they should work things out and compromise on those things that they're able to compromise on that are not matters of principle. Trying to think how we got off on that. Right. So there are some gender roles, so to speak. The husband, yes, is the leader, but he shouldn't be a domineering leader. He should be a servant leader, willing to sacrifice for the good of his wife and for his family. Leading by example, not in word only. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is what the jobs and roles that a husband and wife might have could vary greatly in their marriage based on their situation, based on their jobs, their careers, based on the necessities of, how much they need to make in order to pay for a home and so forth. Whether they have kids or not, obviously that's going to be a huge consideration in, uh, kids and raising your children well should be a priority for parents. Should be much more of a priority than it is for most parents that you see in society. Unfortunately, many parents have completely given over the care of their children to the state via the school system, and the result of that is not good. Um, it is horrific because the Big Bang cosmology that the state teaches is a religious system, and it is 100% at variance with what the Bible teaches. In fact, if you take what the Bible teaches, flip it, and teach the opposite, you end up with Big Bang cosmology. And as I've said in other videos, that should make people stop and think a little bit about the spiritual war that we are in this reality. Anyways, so I, for one, you won't catch me judging, a couple based on their setup. Maybe the dad has a job where he works from home and the wife is actually out in the workplace somewhere. It is what it is. They are accountable for those choices before God, and they need to be careful that they're keeping things in balance in their own relationship, but that is their business, not mine. I'm not going to be judging anyone on that. Others might, who have a more old-fashioned view of things and think that the wife should be at home, stay-at-home mom. But understand that's a rare thing. That's a privilege if you have a man who makes enough that he can support his family by himself. I can't even. I don't know many people like that. Now I think I'm finally, for the first time in my entire life, I've been at my new job for about 3 months. I think this is a job that I could support a family and a wife on completely by myself if I had to. But this is the first time in my life that that has been the case, and I'm in my mid 30s right now. So, grandpa and grandma, maybe you shouldn't be judging these younger folks for the life struggles that they're having, because it is a whole different world now, and a lot of families can't make it unless both parents are working. It's just the reality of things. And yeah, well, as I said, you won't see me judging families for how they have chosen to balance things. I do think that people's priorities are out of whack sometimes, and I will point that out. I do think if priorities are right, it will help to adjust the form of how people choose their work and home life balance, I guess. Um, but as I said, everyone needs to work that stuff out for themselves. So I did want to mention a couple other things. Yes. Let's talk about sexual promiscuity and why it's so destructive. Pornography and why it's so destructive. And homosexuality and the transgender agenda. So, firstly, understand that all these things are ultimately attacks on the nuclear family, which God created, which is the core unit of society, and which, if it breaks down, plunges us into chaos and civilization itself collapses. And we're already seeing um, the repercussions of the free love movement and the internet, a huge percentage of which is dedicated to pornography. And our culture, the USA, um, creates about 75% of all pornography and exports it to the world. Um, just one reason why I believe this is Mystery Babylon. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. But let's talk about these things. Why are they so destructive? Well, you got to understand that sex is an addictive drug. It is as addictive as crack cocaine. And so it's meant to be something that creates this bond in marriage. But understand that in a marriage where husband and wife are having sex regularly, you have a regular supply of sex. You're not, using our addictive drug analogy here, you're not out on the street in dangerous places trying to get your next fix. You can stay home and, as the Bible puts it, you can drink running waters from your own cistern. Sexual promiscuity is dangerous on several levels. Firstly, because there is a spiritual component to sexuality. Every time you have sex, there's that grafting, and then there's a tearing when you're with someone else. Grafting and tearing, grafting and tearing. Now, understand that it's a bit different for someone who might lose their wife and then remarry and stuff like that. That is completely acceptable. But sexual promiscuity, where people are just going out and having tons of partners, it corrodes the soul over time. Nothing separates someone from God and from God's people like sexual sin. It will very rapidly take people out of balance, and it can actually physically destroy their health, destroy their mental well-being. And it can actually poison people for future relationships. And let me lay out why that's the case. So let's say you have a guy, we'll just call him John Doe. And we'll just say John Doe has 15 partners before he meets his wife. Um, 15 sexual partners that he's been, sexually intimate with. Then he meets his wife, someone that he truly loves. He's not in it, just for fun. But his wife isn't very experienced, and so the sex with her just isn't that great compared to how it was with these other partners that he had. This creates an inherent dissatisfaction in the marriage. Understand, if you have been celibate your whole life and then you marry someone and you're only with them, you don't have anything to compare that to, and it becomes a little more challenging, I guess, when someone remarries after losing a spouse or what have you. But there is that understanding there, or there should be, that every love is inherently different. But because of that, there's this real problem where a marriage can get poisoned from the get-go, where two people end up together, they really love each other, but they're both dissatisfied with the sexual component of that relationship because it's just not as good as what they had with so-and-so back in the day in college or what have you. So sexual promiscuity can be pretty dangerous in that. Likewise, pornography. The Bible says that the eyes of man are never satisfied. These things interject a dissatisfaction into the marriage, where if husband or wife is involved in pornography, and 95%, it's my understanding, of men in the West are addicted to porn or sex. And 75% in the ministry, so pastors, teachers, etc. I don't know if these statistics are right or not. That could just be the particular group that was polled or what have you, but pornography is incredibly destructive. And I've heard people say things like, well, I'm okay with my children seeing nudity. I feel like nudity is not as destructive as seeing violence. And so I don't let my children watch violent movies and stuff like that, but I'm okay with them seeing sexuality and nudity. Understand, no, you are giving your child over to what can be basically a drug addiction. It is addictive. It is habit forming. It can have an effect on health. It can detract from relationships. It can poison and ruin marriages. And I'm not being hypothetical here. I know someone who recently, basically his wife caught him, found that he had a porn addiction, and rather than seek help for that, he chose to divorce her instead. He chose pornography over his wife. This stuff destroys marriages. Again, it's poison by way of dissatisfaction. It creates this idea of maybe there's something better out there than what I've got. And so instead of investing 100% in the marriage that you do have in that relationship, there's a part of you that you're holding back from your partner, and energy that you're putting into something else, something that is selfish and a cancer to that marriage. Trying to think if there's something else I really needed to talk about here. I will say this, unfortunately, a lot of people get hooked on this at a very young age. 11 is the average age that kids are exposed to internet pornography. I will say this, I personally was exposed to pornography at a much younger age, probably about 8, give or take a year. It was not internet pornography, though. It was, I was at a garage sale in Pennsylvania with my grandparents and parents, and it was literally a garage sale. There was, tables and stuff out in the driveway, but in this house there were also boxes of stuff in the garage, and people could just kind of pick through. They were set up in aisles and piled up really high and everything. And I came around the corner of one of these rows of boxes, and one wall of the garage was just plastered with centerfolds from, Playboy and Hustler and other magazines. And even at that young age, I was, like I said, 8 years old, give or take a year, somewhere in that range. So 7 to 9, somewhere in there. I knew immediately that I shouldn't look at this stuff, that it was dangerous, but also that I really wanted to. And, I'll just be honest, pornography has been a lifelong struggle. There are times where I'm more controlled than others. It's an ebb and flow thing. I'm not going to pretend that I've ever had complete victory over it. And I don't know, maybe I never will. Homosexuality. So homosexuality and the transgender stuff is actually being marketed and pushed on people. There's a reason for that. Firstly, it does tie into one of the agendas of those who rule our world system. And I've told you before that they are Malthusian in philosophy. They hold to the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who held that resources are always growing in a linear fashion while population grows in an exponential fashion. So at some point, population will outstrip the resources, and there will be famine and catastrophe. Well, Malthus lived before we had much technology at all, and failed to account for a lot of things, like how as humanity, the numbers grow, people will be more motivated to reclaim areas of land that were not arable before, and there's technology like fertilizer, irrigation, mechanization, GMO, um, pesticides, you name it. All manner of things that can multiply the productivity of an acre of ground 100 times compared to what things were in the day of Thomas Malthus. But those who rule over us hold to this view that there's a scarcity of resources, which really isn't true. God's not a fool. I got an AI to admit that this earth could sustain about 50 billion people if the resources weren't being mismanaged by those in power. And I've heard studies and so forth estimate that it's actually more like 80 billion people. But the reality is, those in power are greedy. They don't want to share, and they hate those of us that they consider to be their lessers, and they want to maintain the Earth's population at about 500 million. So this population control agenda is a big part of why homosexuality, the transgender agenda, and things like abortion are sacred sacraments to these people that they will not compromise on, and that they want to force on people. And human beings being what they are, horny and degenerate, they're more than willing to go along with a lot of this stuff without seeing the bigger picture. Homosexuality in particular. I will say that I have struggled with aspects of this at points in my life, but one thing I notice is at those points I was at a very low point in my life and extremely lonely and isolated. And so, let me put it this way: the human organism can derive sexual pleasure from a variety of things. That's why there are sex toys, uh, masturbation, and so forth. When we're talking about homosexuality, yes, it is possible for a person to derive sexual pleasure from someone else of the same gender, and then, because they are another person, a human being, friendship and emotions can get into the mix. And so the homosexual relationship can seem, it is a relationship. There's human components to it. It can be a very confusing thing, but it is not an appropriate relationship. God has laid out man and woman. They were physically designed to complement each other. They've got the right equipment to, make things work. A homosexual relationship is inherently not equal to the marriage relationship that God created for a number of reasons. So, gay marriage, you have two men or two women. How in the world are they? I mentioned this before. Marriage as God created it makes a lot of sense. You have a man and a woman, and so their children, regardless of whether they are boys or girls, can look at their dad as an example of either what I should be as a man or what I should be looking for in a husband if it's a girl, a daughter. And likewise, Boys can look at their mother and say, that's an example of what I should be looking for in a good wife. And the daughters can look at her and say, that's an example of what I should be as a good wife and mother. And ideally, that's how the marriage relationship works. Now, if you have two men trying to raise a child, how are they going to do that? How are they going to model um, both the male and the female roles to their children if they have boys or girls? Even if you have two men raising a boy, um, that boy's going to end up most likely leaning towards homosexuality himself, since that's the only thing that he's seen modeled. He's not going to have any idea of, you know, it's imbalanced. It's not right. And God says that it is wrong. I'm going to be honest with you. On a personal level, I don't really care so much about this, I guess. Uh, except that I will say this: it's not going to lead people to be their best selves. It's just not the way reality is. It's not the way nature is, and God says it's wrong on a spiritual level as well. And that's the main reason that Christians have an issue with homosexuality is God didn't intend it to be that way. It is a corruption um, of the intended natural order. And likewise, the transgender agenda. And again, like I said, there's this motivation of population control behind all this stuff. Homosexuals aren't having natural children. And if they do adopt or what have you, they're most likely going to convert their children to that homosexual lifestyle as well, um, increasing the chances that their kids will not procreate either. And then the trans agenda outright, if you have someone going through that process, they've mutilated their body to the point that they're not going to be able to have natural children. All these things play perfectly into the hands of those who rule over us, who do not want human population growth. I think I'm going to cut this video short here for now. I may revisit some of these topics later on in more detail, but my mind is starting to fall apart on me. So I will see you guys later. Bye.